Hello, good morning, and welcome to Data Masking Insights and Actions. My name is Kendra Little, and I work for Redgate Software, and I am here today to talk about how you can prevent private data from being exposed in your next data breach. And we'll talk a little bit about why I say in your next data breach, like I'm assuming that it's going to happen. Today's webinar is just 30 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and dive in and get started today. I am a Microsoft MVP. That means I've been awarded recognition by Microsoft for talking about managing data over the years. And I was looking over my blog last night. I've been blogging about SQL Server and the Microsoft Data Platform for 9 years these days. And I recently joined Redgate as a product evangelist. Redgate has been around for longer than 9 years. Redgate's been around for 19 years, and 91% of the Fortune 100 use our tools to help in terms of managing databases, deploying changes to databases, and how I first learned about Redgate was saving the day when we accidentally deployed things to SQL Server that we shouldn't have deployed to SQL Server. But today we are talking about the drivers for data masking at large. We're going to talk about what the three big drivers are that mean that organizations are more and more interested in protecting the privacy of customers. We'll also talk about how Redgate solutions simplify this process, and then the next steps that you can take towards compliant database operations, whether or not you choose to use Redgate tools, because regardless of the tools you use or how you go about it, data masking is more and more a really critical project to think about and to pitch to others in your organization. Because in IT, in database management, we have established a really strong history of neglecting privacy. The topic of protecting privacy has gotten more and more attention lately, and it really is needed because we increasingly have data breaches because we have these long established processes where we just don't think about what information we are storing and who may access it. And I am part of this history of neglecting privacy. My first real job in IT, when I first started in IT, I loved working with data, but I couldn't get a job right away as a database administrator because I didn't have experience. And I lucked out, I got a job at a software startup. I was so excited to get to work in software development. I was sort of edging my way closer and closer towards the databases because I was very, very interested in managing data. But I had no thoughts about protecting privacy at that time. And I worked in a build operations team. Part of my job in the build ops team was to help deploy copies of production data to a lot of different environments to be used by multiple development teams and QA teams. And we would take backups of production databases, and my job was all about automating, writing applications in C# and automating the deployment of these environments, which involved simply restoring the production data to these environments, not thinking about what customer information might be in there. And it became readily apparent that this was a problem when accidentally in testing code, we sent out a bunch of emails from some of these pre-production environments to our customers, and our customers responded with some concern because these didn't appear to be valid emails. Has your site been hacked? Well, no, we just hadn't changed the data in these pre-production environments. And so we did start masking some data, but we only masked the email data. And this was something I was part of as part of the process. And then we simply moved on to worry about other problems and to work on other parts of the software deployment. But this was an opportunity. This was a distinct opportunity where I could have pitched, hey, let's think about this larger than simply the problem of, hey, we shouldn't email all these people. Instead of, that is a symptom of emailing all these people. That is a symptom of the larger problem of us having private data in this environment that we shouldn't have. We should address the larger problem. But I just addressed the smaller problem and moved on. But I had a big opportunity to contribute there. Later on, I did get a job as a database administrator as my career evolved. And I worked at another small software company where I helped automate a couple of different ways where we exposed access to the production data. One was we had mirrors of production data that could provide snapshots with read-only access. And that may be fine in terms of data that isn't sensitive, or in terms of setting up a process where periodically access can be granted, knowing exactly what personal data is in there and the people who need to get it. But instead of that, we had widespread internal access to these production mirrors, thereby meaning that people could create linked servers to these. People could get access to query these in ways that if there was a data breach, if their workstation was compromised, they just have access to live production data, not the actual writable copy, but a mirror of all of that production data that then could be exposed. And these things are not always easy to solve. Part of the reason in both of those cases that I didn't have a better solution is that it's not always quick and easy. In terms of doing masking, we have to think about lots of different rules. So sometimes we say, well, instead, and I have attempted this at different points as well. Okay, if it's hard to figure out exactly what data we need to mask and how to mask it without violating foreign keys, without getting into some of the complexity that happens when you get in there, maybe we can just generate data instead. So instead of using production data in our other environments or granting access to some of it, let's just make up the data. Well, things can absolutely go wrong there as well. If we are using purely generated data and we are not very, very careful about generating it in quantities and in distributions that are similar to production, the problem is that performance can really suffer. When it comes to data and performance, let's say I want to know, I'm writing a new query and I need to know how long is this query going to take? It doesn't matter if I'm writing the query in T-SQL or if I'm using a tool to generate the query for my application. I am not going to know exactly what that query is going to do if I'm running it against a tiny data set in development and test, and it only runs against a full-size production data set when it's finally deployed to a customer-facing system. In terms of how a database engine will optimize that query, what indexes it will choose, whether it will be scanning a large amount of data or seeking to a small amount of data, the fact that it's fast in development doesn't mean anything at all if my development doesn't have a representative data set for production. And this is why a simple workaround for masking isn't just generating the data. Yes, we can successfully generate data similar to production, but it's a lot of work because we have to learn what are the critical patterns in the production data that we have to reproduce in the generated data. It has some complexity similar to masking the data. And both the complexity in terms of the data masking, as well as in terms of generating the data, comes in when we think about the referential integrity between tables. And in terms of our data sets, between these tables, how many of the rows in this table do have corresponding rows on this table in terms of how queries will perform if we are joining those tables. We also may need to mask columns. If we're working on a masking solution, we may have to mask columns that are keys between those tables, where there's a parent-child relationship between the tables, and we have to actually generate new values for these columns that are involved in that. We may also have to think about triggers that we have involved in the database that fire every time we change something, and be able to, if we're masking data, disable these triggers, perform a bunch of actions, and then enable them at the end. This isn't easy. There's a lot of complexity involved in there. And the manual nature of carrying these out are part of why back in that build operations job, no one successfully said, let's really look at what data needs to remain private on a larger scale. A lot has changed since those days, since I started in that build ops job. The history we have of neglecting privacy no longer has to stay that way. And part of what's changed is the tools that are available, from tools you can roll yourself with scripting. I mean, PowerShell wasn't a thing when I started way back in that job even. We didn't even have that. But also in terms of the tools that you can evaluate and the tools that you can buy to reduce a lot of that manual work, we've come a long way. So we've made a lot of progress in terms of addressing that complexity, but also a lot has changed in terms of the awareness of leaders in our company that it isn't a question of whether or not we will have a data breach, but when that data breach will occur. It used to be that there was a big single driver for a lot of security projects. This driver is this idea of external threats. A lot of our approach to security and a lot of the awareness that leadership had about why we might have security projects was that we need to protect our organization at the borders from external attackers. So we really need to focus on preventing SQL injection and keeping people from obtaining passwords of privileged users and coming at our production system from outside. After many, many data breaches have occurred and more are announced each day, there are really now 3 big drivers of data masking. And one of the big takeaways I want you to take from this talk is how to explain why protecting data is important even outside of the production environment. Yes, protecting the production environment is still very important. That hasn't changed. But these days, there are really multiple drivers of data masking and reasons to protect the database. Redgate has been named as a representative vendor in the Gartner 2018 Market Guide for Data Masking. And in that guide, one of the big insights they talk about there that I want to share today is that the 3 big drivers for data masking projects are compliance requirements, insider threats, and external threats. These 3 drivers mean that it's more important than ever, and you have a better ability than ever to explain the importance of taking on a project that does have some complexity. In terms of that first driver, which is compliance requirements, 2 of the more recent big famous compliance requirements are on this slide, and they are the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, that was implemented in May 2018. And in that, they highly recommend pseudonymization. This is one of the trickier words to pronounce, or anonymization of data in there. There's also another regulation that passed in June 2018 that's scheduled for implementation in 2020. That is the California Consumer Privacy Act. This one, things could change before it's implemented, but this one is very interesting in terms of there being a private right of action for people who are impacted by data breaches. Under the GDPR, there may be fines by regulatory bodies, but under the California Consumer Privacy Act, there could be class action suits by people who are impacted by data breaches. And there can also be other states in the United States, there are even cities in the United States that are now looking at evaluating and passing privacy regulations. In addition to these, in compliance, we have regulations in the United States, such as SOX and HIPAA, which focus on specific industries. So depending on where your customers are and what industries you are in, there may be multiple compliance reasons that feed into that big driver of compliance for data privacy. And executives do see, according to surveys, there's a recent survey done by Harris Poll, which the company Stripe sponsored for them to do. And they asked more than 1,000 C-level executives to say, what do you see as the biggest threats to your company? And in the top answers were security breaches and compliance and regulations. So two of those, they actually mentioned two of the big drivers for data privacy projects in there. The compliance isn't the only driver for a reason. There are both internal threats and external threats or drivers of this. And this gets complicated because just like back when I was in that build ops job and I was copying data around for different devs teams to use, what I was essentially doing was, in an automated fashion, I was leaking private data around inside our company, and I was leaking that data to non-secure environments. This doesn't happen only with data to be used by developers and testers. We also have to think about data that can be used by analysts, data that can be used by people in our company who are reporting on what our customers are doing and how we can improve things for our customers who may not directly be developers. Wherever we are granting access to data or copying data, we need to think about whether the private elements of that data should be masked. The threat from insiders in the company of taking bad actions, maybe because of being dismissed, maybe because of other reasons, is significant. And if you have an insider threat, is the insider going to think about taking data from the production database, which is more highly monitored and more highly locked down? I think probably they're going to look first at less secured environments where data has been copied or backups have been stored in terms of accessing that data. And it's not just an ill-intentioned insider that's doing this either. If you are an external hacker and you want to get access to the private data a company uses, you may investigate vulnerabilities in the production servers themselves, but you're also going to look for ways to infiltrate the company and access less secured pools of data. And if the data has not been masked, that is now something that you can leak. My colleague, Steve Jones, he shared at one of our SQL in the City events that he attended a security conference recently. And one of the things mentioned as a big threat by folks at that conference is that bad actors in the business space, if you are a bad actor and you want to damage your competition, one of the tools that these bad actors can use these days is to hire someone or themselves attempted data breach on a competitor, because that, by doing so, that will damage the brand of that company. Their customers will lose faith in them, and the bad actor may gain significant market value by supporting a data breach massively unethically and illegally. I'm not suggesting in any way that this is something that should be doing, but it is a real concern by folks in the security field that data breaches have become a competitive tool by bad actors. By looking at and explaining these multiple drivers of threats, it helps illuminate why masking data is such an important tool in terms of protecting your customers as well as your organization's brand. And that understanding of why these copies of personal data spread around our environment can be such an important thing to protect. We think this is a very important thing at Redgate, and because of the complexity involved in doing this, we have built tools that help simplify the data protection project. And the information I'm talking about here, you could use to start a data masking project with our tools. You could use it to start a data masking project where you're evaluating a range of tools or considering rolling your own as well. When you do this, when you are doing static data masking, that is masking the data itself at rest, so that if someone gains access to a physical backup of that data, or if someone gains active access to the data source itself, the data has been permanently changed. There are multiple things that you want to think about when you set up that masking project. What data do you need to substitute when you're masking. We have our data masking tools let you swap in data, but also you may want to consider shuffling data. One of the interesting complexities when it comes to data masking is if we stay super simple when we are masking data, then people may still be able to learn a lot or recreate information about associated data that's on the same row. So you might want to not only create substitutions for data, but also move around data in specific columns so that the rows are not the same in terms of being able to potentially be recreated. You also will want to think about when tables have relationships with one another and you are changing data in some tables. If, for instance, we do have those key relationships, we may want to make related changes between the parent table and the child tables. We also will need to run custom commands when we're setting this up. It isn't just about changing the data. We will need to manage those triggers, to manage those foreign keys, and disable a set of things at the beginning of the masking and re-enable them at the end. So when you are evaluating different tools for this, these are some of the features for static data masking that I think about after having worked with this a bit. And there can be some pain in doing this. Let's say that I want to mask data in multiple different dev environments, or not just multiple dev environments, but also data that's being accessed by analysts, say. Back when I was in that DevOps group, it was a matter of restoring full copies of different data everywhere. So on these very large databases, if I have a database that's multiple terabytes, masking every single copy of the data isn't that attractive because I have to restore the production data, make a bunch of changes to it, and then either do that on every environment I'm deploying to, or then make an additional backup and then start restoring again. We have created a tool called SQL Provision that combines our abilities to mask data with abilities to clone data so that you can apply masking to an image and then very, very quickly clone that image, speeding up the time it takes to get the masked data to different people who may use it, as well as to support self-service and provisioning to those customers. So thinking about, okay, in terms of masking the data, what data sizes am I working with and how much time is it going to take to apply this masking when delivering it to the people who need to get the data is going to, how quickly you can do that will impact the success of the project. Whether or not self-service is important is an interesting requirement to know, or whether or not that will be helpful, and making sure that you can manage that referential integrity. In terms of scoping the project, you want to think about that heavily before you set a deadline for when you're going to have this project done. The process of masking itself, there's really 3 steps, and we are evolving these steps too. One of the first steps is identifying data to mask. This is part of the process that we think is increasingly important and which we want to accelerate for you. And we do have some early access programs in terms of looking at our new tools, which can help you more intelligently and more quickly catalog your data and keep a record of where sensitive data is in your environment and what types of regulations it is prone to, what types of threats might occur because of that data. Once you have identified the data and mask, you want to think about, okay, let's get into the masking sets and the rules. Of these things that are sensitive data, what are the ways in which we will actually implement the masking? And then move into testing, validating, and automating. And in this portion, handling things like, okay, how long does it actually take to deploy our masking, and how can we validate that it has worked successfully, as well as handling things like provisioning. For those early access programs, one of them that I would consider joining, you can join at redgate.com/datamasker-EAP. EAP stands for Early Access Program. And we do have a great masking solution right now that has terrific documentation in terms of how do I deal with scenario X, scenario Y, scenario Z. But that doesn't mean that we are stopping with that. We want to build more intelligent tools and tools that are specifically shaped to the evolving requirements of our customers and potential customers as regulations change, as the size of data and the complexity of the environments people are working with are evolving. You can join this early access program for free and help us understand the specific scenarios that you are working with and help us build solutions that really address your real world problems as well. So we would appreciate it if you do join us on that. In terms of who's involved in this, one of the interesting things about data masking is I think it's a huge opportunity for professionals who work with data. Looking back at my career, this was a project that if I had understood more about the threats that would be mitigated by doing this, I could have really proposed this project and started to scope it out. I could have done a prototype of it and moved forward a really important improvement for our organization. And that would have been an amazing thing to put on my resume. That would have been a terrific thing for me to talk about with my clients later on when I was a consultant. Having experience in launching, justifying, prototyping, and implementing data masking is a huge career builder because these three big drivers for data masking are increasingly on the minds of leaders across companies and ITs and IT organizations. So this is something that developers and DBAs can initiate the project. It's also something that software and IT managers can initiate. Anyone who wants to access production data could also initiate this as well. I did have developers who I've worked with, who one of the architects I first worked with back at that startup, he didn't want production access at all. He's a super smart fellow. I learned so much from working with him, but he was very funny in talking with him because other developers, they would want access to help them troubleshoot. They would constantly be like, I need this access so I can do my job better, but not David. David said, no, the less access to private data I have, the better. Because when anything goes wrong, there can be no question that I wasn't involved. And he was really collaborative. He was great at writing documentation. He was really collaborative to work at. But one thing that could have helped him do better would be to provide him with masked data that he could access safely outside of production. And if he had initiated that project, he certainly could have pulled it off, and it would have been another item that he did that really benefited the company well. So I think anyone who has an interest in accessing the data can really launch this. Really, developers and database administrators are the most natural to implement this because of that complexity in terms of figuring out what relationships do we need to be concerned about and how do we manage that. But in terms of initiating the project, justifying it, and getting support, that part of the process can really happen outside of those teams as well, or it can happen inside those teams too. To get started, if this sounds like an opportunity that could really help you and your organization, and I think for a lot of us out there, there are many different places where we could have some big wins and really protect our private data. The first steps are to make your case, and downloading the Gartner's Market Guide to Data Masking. I've got a URL coming right up where you can get a complimentary copy of that. That can help in terms of sharing these drivers with others in your organization. Following that, prototype it out. We have free trials of our tools that you can use if you would like to create a prototype with our tools, and move that project along. When you do deploy, this is a step that a lot of people forget about. Champion your project, show off what you did within your organization, and explain why it is so important. We don't want to just deploy something like this and then forget about it. We want to celebrate what we've done and encourage other people in our organization to think about where they are storing data, whether it's in relational databases or whether it's in flat files on the web servers, but to really add to the awareness of the need to protect that data and the vulnerability that our organization is in if this isn't built into our processes to naturally classify and protect data. You can get your complimentary copy of the 2018 Market Guide for Data Masking at redgate.com/Gartner. We are proud to be listed as a representative vendor in the report, so grab your complimentary copies today. And for those listening in on the audio, I'm going to repeat the URL again. It is redgate.com/Gartner, where you can download the complimentary copy of that report. One other item that you can do, this is not necessarily all about data masking. Redgate is currently hosting a survey. It's the 2019 State of Database DevOps Survey. And if you complete the survey, you will be entered to win. If you choose to enter, if you choose to provide your contact information, you can enter to win a $250 Amazon gift card. You do not have, you can remain anonymous. You do not have to provide contact information if you don't want. You do not have to be doing DevOps if you want. Just tell us about your database processes. This helps us figure out what are people really doing out there, not what do we want to do, in part, what do we want to do, but then also what are we actually doing? And this helps us create and track a history of how people are really managing databases out there, the toughest problems that they're facing, and how people solve those problems. And then we can share that with the community. You can take that survey at redgate.com/DBD survey, and the survey will close on Friday, November 30th, 2018. By participating, you also can get early access to the survey results. For information on prototyping and checking out our projects, contact sales@redgate.com. If you want to check out SQL provision and work with our masking and cloning tools, they can help set you up with that free trial as well as provide you with more information. Thanks so much for joining me today for this quick 30-minute talk on how data masking can help you and your organization. And I hope that I've inspired you to champion your customers' privacy and also to protect your organization from the increasing vulnerabilities with mishandling that private data. I'm Kendra Little from Redgate, and I hope to see you again in a webcast soon. Thanks, folks.